I'm a political scientist here at the Center of Social Science and Humanities, Centre de Sciences Humaines. On the behalf of the CSH, it's my very great pleasure to welcome all of you, and we're already nearly 50 on the Zoom to our third series of seminar and lecture series here at CSH. As many of you know, our events are aimed at addressing contemporary and historical issues in South Asian societies with a resolute interdisciplinary focus that is both social but also political, economic, and spatial. We study those dynamics. To give you a sense of the wide range of disciplines we are grappling with, in 2 weeks we'll be welcoming Mathieu Faure, a researcher here at CSH, who is a mathematician. We'll be discussing question of inequalities from a mathematical and statistical point of view. Today we are putting up our warmest, in fact, aspirational English as we welcome Satish Deshpande. He's a professor here in Delhi of sociology in D School, the Delhi School of Economics. He barely needs an introduction, of course. He occupies a very special space in our intellectual landscape as an academic, elegant writer, and disciplinary reporters. So he's very familiar to students of South Asia for his work on caste, but also merit inequalities, etc. His latest book is a largely revisited version of his contemporary India sociological view. And today we'll be speaking on English and its uses here in India from both a sociological point of view, but also from a personal standpoint. So I will leave the floor to Satish. The talk will be for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have a very convivial discussion, and I'm sure very fruitful interaction with Satish Deshpande. So Satish, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Thomas and CSH for this opportunity. I will be using, unfortunately, PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to now put it up, and we will hope for the best. Please do let me know immediately, because I can't see the screen that you're seeing, in case there's something that is not working.
Definitely.
Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we are. I mean, at least on my side.
Okay, okay. So as I said, thanks to CSH and to Jean-Thomas for this invitation. This is one of those things of, work that one hopes is in progress. And I'm, for various reasons, it's got stalled. And I'm hoping to get started again using this occasion. So let me say, the title is before you. Let me say something very quickly about, these are basically these kind of, this is the route that I'll be following. So I'll start with a few remarks on the origins of this project, then on a little bit on privilege, then on the link between language and privilege, and finally I'll come to the specificities, basically the body of what I want to talk about. So the share of time and discussion is unequal between these various headings. I'll be spending, hopefully, most of the time on the last topic, which is which is really what is important. But to get there, I think it helps to know where I'm coming from. So this is just a kind of map for you, and I'll be returning to this just to orient you along the way. So let me get started with where I'm coming from. This is the first installment, so to speak, of this project came out in the form of an essay that came out a little more than a year ago in the India Forum that many of you were kind enough to comment on. In it, I was basically trying to, in a sense, further my long-term project, which is that of producing a contemporary account of caste and its purchase on the social in India. And the main, since we are in the era of viruses and so on, it's useful to think in terms of this kind of a metaphor, as caste has, in many ways, caste has mutated itself. The phenomenon that we call caste has mutated itself and is resistant to many of the older forms of analysis. And in order to understand it today, we need new techniques. My own work has been focused really around the idea of castelessness, which I believe to be quite central to the functioning of caste today. And the production of this castelessness was unintentionally facilitated by independence and the post-colonial state precisely through its nationalist and modernist aspirations. This is a story I've told elsewhere, so I'm not going to be talking more about it. So essentially, the challenge is to undermine or to produce a compelling counter to various forms of caste denial, particularly the denial of caste on the part of those who have benefited the most from it, namely the upper castes. So one of the major strategies of denial and of is what I have called elsewhereization, where on the one hand, caste has been studied in the academy quite relentlessly and at great length, and on the other hand, it has been declared to be always elsewhere. That is elsewhere in relation to people like us. Those who did the studying, or the vast majority of those who did the studying, were somehow seen as and saw themselves as studying from the outside, so to speak. So caste is an undeniable presence actually, but what is actually meant by caste and where it is located are what, in a sense, facilitate caste denial on the part of the so-called upper castes. And this has really been this is what I've been trying to pursue through various ways. And it has seemed to me lately that perhaps one of the most useful things that could be done as part of this project is to produce good descriptions of caste privilege. Over time, we have now accumulated, I think, fairly good descriptions of caste oppression or caste discrimination. More needs to be done there as well, but we have a body of material. When it comes to caste privilege, we really don't have very much. And what we have is still trapped in the unproductive, in a conceptual sense, unproductive frameworks of guilt or disavowal, which does not help in terms of thinking about how caste reproduces itself. So I have been experimenting, therefore, with a new kind of, what is for me a new kind of way of writing about it, that I tried in this essay that is shown here in the India Forum. A kind of a semi-autobiographical mode. I'm still not very not at ease with this. And this is not whatever I've seen that calls itself autoethnography. I have really not liked. So I'm not quite sure what this is and whether this will work and so on. But the idea is to make the descriptions compelling. That's the motive. The motive to bring in the personal is to bring a new kind of purchase on the reader, and especially the upper caste reader. And I'm wondering whether this is a way to do it. But this is a very risky thing, and I'm not quite sure whether it will work. And therefore, as part of this larger enterprise, I thought of using language as a kind of side door into privilege. So this is where I'm coming from. That's what this project is about. And the first installment, as I said, is in this essay. And I'm trying to move forward from this essay here. And what I will present here would be something very sketchy and incomplete as yet. So let's get going. The next stage is to talk about privilege. I wasn't aware until very recently that there's actually a field called privilege studies that is now, there's even a journal, at least one journal that I've come across, and I'm sure there'll be more and so on. And now that I've tried to read up on it now after I discovered it, it's coming largely out of the US context and out of discussions of gender and race. And it's been interesting for me to look at this field that I did not know existed at the point when I was starting to look at privilege. The first conceptual issue that comes up is, what precisely are we talking about when we talk about privilege? And I'll say something in a very general and sketchy way to indicate to you the directions in which I'm headed. The obvious kind of distinction to draw right in the beginning is between privilege and power, because privilege has to be something distinct from power itself, even though they may be related. But what is it that is different? There are some interesting discussions of this distinction located within the larger discussion on power, particularly post-Foucauldian discussions on power, which try to bring back some of the older concerns in more refined ways, and fending off the usual accusations of essentialism and so on. So the usual discussion is about distinctions between power to, power over, power as a capacity, power versus power as an attribute. Relative to all of this, privilege is more something that is more sedimented, that is more institutionalized. That is a condition or a state rather than actively involving some kind of capacity. There's more to be said here, and I'm happy to enter into it in discussion. Right now, I need to move on to talk about its relational aspects. As the Oxford English Dictionary definitions I've shown on that, I've given only the first 3 definitions. Please look at the underlined parts. The underlined parts are clearly, even in an etymological sense, the English word privilege emphasizes its relational aspect, since privilege is something exceptional. That is, it is different from what is the norm. So it is a special favor, it is a distinction, it is an advantage that is not available to others, and so on. So keeping this relational thing in mind, which is also, of course, common to discussions of power, particularly Foucauldian discussions of power, have emphasized its relational aspect. What is decisively different, I think, about privilege is institutionalization. Most forms of privilege, in order to function as privilege, need to be settled, at least in an immediate sense. And in this sense, privilege is a more domesticated, a more established sort of thing than an ongoing power relationship for that, uh, by way of comparison. To say a little bit more about um, how I have found the comparisons and contrasts with privilege studies, which come out of women's studies, feminist work on trying to identify sources of patriarchy, patriarchal common sense shared also by women. And finally, most recently, in critical race studies and the popularity of this field in the last decade. I think that from whatever I have read so far of privilege studies and its relative decline during recent years, after a very meteoric rise in the after between about 2005 to about 2015, 16. I think that there has now been a lot of pushback on this. Some of the reasons have to do with how privilege studies position themselves in relation to what they were trying to do. And I think one of the major problems has been the almost exclusive emphasis on privilege as a form of unearned or undeserved advantage of some kind. And as soon as one comes up with a description of this sort, pushback is inevitable. And I've found very striking parallels with what we have in India, parallels with the perennial discussions and debates on merit and reservation and so on, where exactly this sort of pushback is encountered. So to define privilege as something that is undeserved and unearned, I think leaves out important aspects of it. And that's what I would like to try and focus on. And these important aspects are, first of all, the kinds of exclusion, where institutionalized exclusion, normalized exclusion, routinized exclusion that privilege presupposes. One is able to maintain privilege as a special distinction only by denying it to others, only by blocking its democratization. And that is, I think, an important aspect that needs to be always underlined. The other aspect, which I've already mentioned, is this privilege studies also talks about, is the systemic and systematic nature of these privileges, which are independent of individuals and which are, as I've said earlier, sedimented and usually settled to the point where questioning these privileges is not easy, particularly because they are often enmeshed within other justificatory frameworks, such as the justificatory framework of the market, the justificatory framework of the state, and other such things, which I hope I'll to show you some examples of. And also in a somewhat slightly looser sense, slightly weaker sense, I think privilege also needs to take account of a certain kind of disproportion. That is to say, a certain extra that privilege gets you in return for the same kind of effort or the same kind of situation that others may also be in. But for the privileged person, the returns on that resource tend to be greater than what they would be for other persons. This is just my initial sense of how we might sidestep some of the problems that I think privilege studies have got bogged down in, and to also counter the kinds of backlash that privilege studies have been facing. So we need to move beyond the framework of unearned advantages. And that's essentially what I will be trying to do. I've already talked about this. And the three areas that I want to focus on in my description would be mobility, distinction, and agency. These are areas that I had figured out already. I mean, I had marked out already for work, and that's where I'm going. Just to sort of spell it out, I'll be trying to look at privilege and its role in mobility, its role in distinction, and its role in agency, while keeping in mind that discussion of privilege in the mode that I'm proposing, that is to try and make those descriptions compelling by introducing the intimacy of personalized experience into them, is full of risks, while keeping that in mind. Moving now to language. I won't say very much here. The starting point to talk about this, as Pierre Bourdieu has noted in Language and Symbolic Power, is the contrast between the linguistic model of language and what Bourdieu in particular has been trying to do.
No, I made sure this thing.
In terms
sandwich,
of,
you said, no, I made a bread of toast bun.
In terms of, sorry, where was I? Yeah. In terms of the contrast between the pure linguistic view, which takes language as a singularity, whereas in social life, language must always and is always plural. So even when we are talking about a single proper name like French or English or Hindi or any other language, these are never singular. There are many varieties of that same language itself, quite apart from, of course, other languages in the vicinity of this. So we need to, when we try to link language to privilege, we need to begin by underlining the plurality of language and its manyness, so to speak. And again, following from Bourdieu, the fact that both state and market are invested, so to speak, in language quite directly, and particularly the state produces norming effects through the creation of official languages, the creation of correct or proper languages. And as soon as you have a norm language, you have the production of lack or deficit, because in comparison, every other language is found wanting when compared to. And this is the standard Foucauldian sort of a description of the disciplinary power wielded by a norm with respect to everything that is measured against it. So we have complex situations of the inequality of languages, where when we say languages, we include variants of what is ostensibly the same language in that spectrum. And privilege, the link between language and privilege is essentially rooted in the inequality of languages, and that's where it arises from. Once again, these issues I'll be looking at with respect to these three ideas or sites of mobility, distinction, and agency. Okay, so I've managed to race through the initial part, and now we come to what I hope we can spend a little bit more time on, and this is the specificities of language in the contemporary context. So, as everyone knows, language is a very complex issue, like most other issues. It's a very complex issue in the Indian context, and we have had very robust language nationalisms. The plural is particularly important here. Our language nationalism has never been singular, and we have had a very complex dynamic between the global power of a language like English, for example, vis-a-vis the many so-called state or official languages, with the special case of Hindi and its claim on a national scale as different from similar but scaled down claims on the part of many regional languages. And the state has been directly involved in the production of privilege via language, and I hope to talk a little bit more about that. Once again, English has also been written about a great deal, and it is in a very unique position. I think in the 21st century, it does not make sense to call in any simple way English as a foreign language. So it is definitely an Indian language as well, but it is a very peculiar, it's a very unique Indian language. Just to flag the standard extremes which define the field within which a very mobile, very dynamic field within which English, the effectivity of English is staged. On the one hand, we have the standardized dominant nationalist narrative of English as a foreign language, not just a foreign language, but the language of the colonizer, against which is a powerful symbol of the colonizer, of colonial rule itself, and therefore this symbol must be erased wherever possible. This is one obvious kind of, this is one surface, shall I say, of a particular kind of political project. At the other extreme from this is what might, for want of a better term, be called a Dalit perspective, since it has been articulated most clearly by Dalit scholars or scholars who speak of, in the name of Dalits and Bahujans. The Dalit perspective is hostile to the idea of the indigenous. The nationalist perspective that I just mentioned juxtaposes an authentic indigenous language versus the alien, oppressive colonizers' language. The Dalit perspective tries to stand this on its head by saying that what might look like colonizing language to the dominant sections of society is a liberating language to the oppressed sections of society. And so we have English as savior, English as one of the blessings of British rule that interrupted the oppression on the cultural and symbolic oppression of the lowest castes by the dominant or the upper castes. And so we have a well-known phenomena of theorists like Chandrabhan Prasad or Kancha Elia praising English and speaking of it specifically as a liberating force. And the temple to the goddess English and so on, that many of you may have heard of, that Chandrabhan Prasad in particular has been associated with. So English is caught in this unique position of being unable to erase the marks of its foreignness, even as it becomes more and more Indian and more embedded into Indian society. And particularly when it comes to the three areas that I spoke of, particularly the first two, mobility and distinction, English is almost an inevitable resource. It is very difficult in contemporary Indian context. One will really have to look for stories of mobility, significant mobility, which are completely independent of English. There are such stories, but they tend to be exceptional stories. Yeah. And also attempts to build distinction in the normal, like, social sense, a distinction in the form of setting oneself up as an elite of some kind, also has a reference to English at some point, at least at one remove, if not directly. So all of this needs to be kept in mind when we speak of the links between English and privilege. And what I would like to suggest really, and that is what I would like eventually, the kind of accounts that I'm asking for, asking to be produced, I'm hoping that those accounts will complicate and provide a more nuanced picture of the somewhat quick acceptance of the link between English and privilege. This has become a very much more complicated link to my mind, as so many of us are aware, than the simplistic way in which it is, in which it is portrayed. So we need to look at specific sites. We need to look at specific modalities of how access to English or a relationship to English of some kind would work with respect to mobility, with respect to distinction, and with respect to agency. Agency is easily the most difficult to talk about, and I will come to it last. We also need to be aware that we need to produce, as part of our account, we need to explicitly address issues of production. How is the link between English and privilege produced? How is it reproduced? Because this reproduction almost always involves also a repositioning. So let me start with, one final point, plurality. This is true of basically all languages, but is, I think, very, very specially and very consequentially true of English. And many of the most significant others of English, most significant in the sense that where the contrast between the English and its other provides the most leverage, provides the most purchase, are indeed varieties of itself. So the contrast between one kind of English and another kind of English is a particularly fertile source of mobility or distinction and also to some extent of agency as well. So let me look quickly at the role of the state. And here I'm looking at the census and what it does. This looks like a very complicated diagram. It actually isn't. It's just a question of sorting out the operation, the stages and so on. What this is describing is how the Indian census defines languages. So essentially we start with, and this is the most recent census, the 2011 census for which we have data. Essentially we start with the enumerator, the census enumerator, asking people what is the language that they speak. And for the 2011 census, we had 19,569 such mother tongues. Through a process that of elimination followed by the census that uses different criteria, starting with linguistic criteria, which are not specified in the census. We go through different steps. So the first step is the rationalization of the thousands of mother tongues returned by people to rationalized mother tongues and in the category of unclassified names. Then we move to specifically languages, from mother tongue to language, again using linguistic criteria. Then the census uses number. Mother tongues with more than 10,000 speakers are privileged. They are classified in a different way. Again, a combination of number and linguistic criteria. And then finally, we come to what is essentially largely a political classification between the scheduled and the non-scheduled languages. There have been many language agitations for particular languages to be included in the 8th schedule of the Constitution, which recognizes languages. And some have succeeded, some are still trying. Just to give you a sense of what this process is, essentially the 19,569 names that we start with, more than 99%, about 99.4% of them get, in a sense, erased or clubbed under different criteria, and we end up with only 121 state-recognized languages, 22 scheduled languages, and 99 non-scheduled languages. There are particular legal consequences. Languages in this sense, roughly speaking, are also rights-bearing entities, and a scheduled language has certain rights. And the other languages don't have similar rights. But the point I really wanted to make was that, apart from the old cliche about a language is a dialect with an army sort of thing, I just wanted to emphasize that the role of the state in calling something a language in the first place, and in according it a particular status. So if we look through this lens, English as a mother tongue is insignificant. It, according to the 2011 census, about 2.6 lakh or 260,000 people returned English as their mother tongue. So as a mother tongue, English accounts for 0.02 or something like that, 0.02 or something like that of the population, completely insignificant. However, as some of you may know, and as has been highlighted occasionally in the press, English is India's second language. It's the second language, second largest language in India. Not something that you would guess. If our census is being very, it has to be given our linguistic situation, has been very diligent about collecting information on bilingualism and trilingualism. So we have, at least for the past 3 censuses, we have data on three languages in addition to one more. So 4 languages in all. So if we add up the second and third languages known by people, that is the non-mother tongue, so to speak, English comes second place. So if you add up all speakers, everybody who knows the language, all speakers, then English has 12.9 crore people. That is 129 million people in India say that they know English or speak English. And this is, of course, far behind the leading language, which is Hindi, with little more than 69 crores or 690 million. But there are interesting sidelights to this, where if only third languages are known, I mean, are counted. If we look at the count for third languages, English is the largest third language in India. In fact, it's almost double the number of third language speakers of English are 4.6 crores or 46 million, whereas the next language is Hindi, which is 2.4 crores. So when it comes to third language, English is by far ahead. Finally, you need to know that I'm showing you this precisely to illustrate this point. What is called Hindi, the proper name Hindi, in fact is 57 languages, of which only one is actually the proper name Hindi. There are 56 other mother tongues that are grouped under the term Hindi and counted as Hindi. 61% of those who are counted as Hindi speakers by the census have in fact their mother tongue also as Hindi. But that means that 39% of people who speak other mother tongues are included under Hindi. So Hindi is a portmanteau term. It's a collective term. It's not really a single language. On the other hand, obviously, when we look at English as a first language, it has no dialects, it has no mother tongues under it. So we need to keep this in mind. I want to talk briefly now about schools. This is what this is one of the main areas that I would like to continue the kind of narrative that I had in the first essay on. Just to begin with a broad, according to the latest data we have, which actually which are little old, almost a decade old. Roughly 15% of primary schools in India had English as the medium of instruction. Roughly 21% of middle schools and almost 29% of secondary schools were nominally English medium. So in other words, a little more than 1/4 of our schools claim to be English medium, that is, have where their medium of English is, medium of instruction is English. However, as we all know, anybody who's spent any time in India knows, English medium is a very elastic term, and it can mean a lot of things. And often English medium is more negative description. That is, it is to indicate that the school concerned or the institution concerned um, does not officially use Indian languages, rather than whether it actually uses English and the extent to which it uses English is, as they say, an empirical question. It needs to be determined by actually going to the institution concerned. And then we have the idea of a convent school, which in common language refers to an English school, usually, at least in the beginning, Christian, although now it is not, no longer, I mean, the majority of such schools, I think, no longer Christian, even though they may take Christian names. And there are interesting variants as well. Next to my mother's house in Hubli, there is a school that calls itself Vigneshwara Kannada Convent. So it's an attempt to recruit the adjective convent, but also attach the word Kannada to it to produce a new kind of yoking. Anyway, so schools are a major site where privilege is produced by offering access to particular kinds of English. And here, I'd like to say a little bit about my own school, which was run by Australian Jesuits. So one of the main issues in terms of the kind of English to which one has access, one of the main issues is who were you taught by? And if you are taught by a native English speaker, your English tends to be of a different variety. So, like most so-called convent schools, my school did not teach me grammar. It taught me usage. And this is one of the major dividers, so to speak. Those who are convent school educated often don't know very much grammar, whereas those who've been to Indian language, medium of instruction in Indian language are very good at English grammar, including, for example, my father was very good at grammar, but very bad at usage. It also taught us to recognize and consciously stay away from what we learned to call Indian English, which is a distinction that would not be immediately available to someone. So we were taught about phrases like that luggage is always singular, no matter how many pieces of luggage there are. That sometimes a word like government can be used in the plural. And that phrases like return back are Indian English and should be avoided. My school also taught us, for a while at least, for several years, spoken English. So we learned about aspirated consonants. So most of the class, spoken English class, was spent puffing out our pers and ters, p's and t's, and learning to swallow our b's and d's. Literature, it taught us literature very, very compellingly. It made our teacher, who was also our principal, who was an Australian Jesuit, successfully interpellated us through discussions of literature. So we had Shakespeare, we had Macbeth for 11th, And I can still recite large parts of it. That we learned not just the text itself, we learned to read around the text. We learned about critics like F.R. Lewis. This is all in high school. We learned that there was this man called A.C. Bradley, who was the best known Shakespeare scholar. And we even learned a little limerick that that said that Shakespeare was brought back to life and had to take an exam on his own work, and he failed. He did very badly because he hadn't read Bradley, so on. Stuff like this, trivia having to do with the English literature. We had Dickens, we had William Golding, Lord of the Flies. We had among the poets we had Wordsworth and Keats, of course, are standard, but we had Thomas Hardy as a poet. We had T.S. Eliot, we had Robert Frost, and most of all, we had a very thorough and a very deep introduction to these texts compared to what the average school-going person would get. So when I arrived at this elite college in Delhi, completely without any cultural capital of any other kind, being first generation urban, being very, very small town, and completely unused to the kind of culture that was there at this college. The fact that I could talk about clothing metaphors in Macbeth, or that I knew about iambic pentameter, what iambic pentameter was, or the allegories involved in Lord of the Flies, things like this acted as cultural capital and allowed me to enter groups and become parts of groups which otherwise would not have been possible. So I'm taking too long, so I need to rush. So schools are a very, very important site, and we need better accounts of what happens in school with respect to language, and in particular with respect to relationship between language and privilege. The varieties of English, I've already mentioned Indian English as something to be recognized and distance oneself from, and so on. This is where the most change has happened, to my mind, where now the relationship between English and Indian languages has changed significantly. But the place of English is not lost. English continues to be very, very crucial, even if other languages are now mixed in different proportions. So we might begin, we might think of a spectrum of mixing, which starts by taking a few English words into Hindi or whatever other Indian language there may be. I'm only using Hindi as a prototype here, as a placeholder. And from there, we move to the other end of the spectrum of mixtures, where certain some amount of the Indian language needs to be present for various social reasons, but the major part of the vocabulary has shifted to English. So if we think of a spectrum of that sort, we need to do this better in greater detail, and we need to think of how this spectrum works and how leverage is generated, momentum is generated through contrasts. So mobility is literally by leveraging oneself from one kind of English to another. That is one kind of one avenue of mobility or movement in terms of status. There is also movement through access to English and in the first place, whatever kind of English, and the context that it affords. But I think this is a very fruitful area to look at. These are again obvious. Others have also been working here. Both consumer culture and mobility enhancing jobs. I'm talking about jobs that are socially ambiguous in their description, in the class overtones of their description, such as IT jobs. So when a person says that they are working in IT, they could be doing anything in terms of actual salaries, in terms of actual competences, and so on. But it is, socially speaking, um, a productive kind of ambiguity. It's an enabling kind of ambiguity. And I think there is a direct connection between English and this kind of mobility, access to English and this specific kind of mobility. Consumer culture, yes, but the mixture has to be talked about. The most difficult thing to talk about really is agency, and this is where I find myself challenged the most. And I think this is something that can only perhaps be done in writing. The visceral sense one has of agency when you first experience control over a language, where you realize that you can use the language to make something that you and only you have thought of. And this could be a very mundane thing, like a school exercise or a homework exercise of some kind. But when that realization, this may not be entirely self-conscious in the sense that you don't realize the full implications of what is happening. But when that happens, it has a lot of ripple effects. And of course, language is not the only route to agency. There are many other routes to agency. But I think language-related agency, particularly when it is linked to English, has the advantage that English is in turn linked to many mobility-enhancing avenues and routes and sites. So an experience of agency via English is particularly powerful in propelling, in fueling ideas of both of mobility as well as distinction. I think I'll stop here because I've overshot my time. As I said, this is very, this is very messy. It's really work that is still going on, and I hope to be able to write it up, which is the only form in which I think it will stabilize. So I will be very grateful for your comments and your critical remarks at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Satish, for this very generative, inspiring, and richly textured messiness. It's really, really kind of you.
Presenting now?
Yes. Sorry, Sid. What did you say?
I will just get the screen off.
Yes, so that everyone can see you, and hopefully we will collect many questions from the audience. So how we will proceed is that people who are wishing to ask a question to Satish can unmute themselves in order to do so. Just 1 second. Alternatively, because we are around 80 participants, it is possible to raise your hand. There's a way to do that in the chat box, or ask a question by written and I will relay it. If you choose the first option to unmute yourself, please try to not step on others, right? So is there any first question, comment, remarks? Yes, Nicolas.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for this nice presentation. Very interesting. I was wondering whether at some point you are planning to link this discussion on the language and privilege in India to these theories of linguistic justice that have been developed in the last 15 years, notably by the Belgian philosopher Philip van Parijs. You may have heard of that. I don't know if you. So there has been, I think, an interesting discussion that you could perhaps connect to this, this idea of, inequality and just in language mastering, and the problem it poses to justice, and some normative solution that have been proposed to that, and which seems to be a little, I mean, not only a little, but quite related to what you very interestingly presented today. So I was wondering whether you, at some point, since it's a preliminary work, as you were saying, at some point you were, planning to connect this to some theory of linguistic justice, or perhaps not. I mean, I don't know.
Thank you. I was not aware of this specific literature. I'd be very grateful for references, or where to begin. There's this huge area. Language is probably the most studied foundational kind of subject in the social sciences. So I'm constantly discovering how little I know in so many directions. So I'd be very grateful for references. Linguistic justice, you said. I will of course search for it, but if you could give me specific references, I would be very happy. Thank you.
From the chat box, we have a series of questions, and then maybe we can move to Cyan. I think Cyan raised his hand. Lalita is asking about references on the topic. CZG might be Christophe Guilmoto, but I'm not too sure. Is asking, in a broader perspective of language struggle, aren't we witnessing these days to the powerful comeback of Hindi to the public fore? How would you interpret the potential future decline of English hegemony in India?
I think that's probably Christophe. Thank you, Christophe, for the question. Yes, the political arena is the most important one where changes have been occurring. Let me answer your question obliquely. The rise of Hindi in the current context, specifically the current context, and the noises being made in the political sphere around it are of course very real, but it is also one of the first areas where even powerful formations are willing to retreat, as we are seeing. And secondly, more interestingly for me, has been the continued presence of English in the shadows. So, for example, I mean, since I don't have it fully thought out, I'm going to give you examples. One of the most striking anecdotes that I've come across was about Lalu Prasad Yadav as one of the consummate, exactly the kind of politician whose rise has nothing to do with English. At least that is how one would think. He's a quintessential people's language person. But apparently, he takes notes at meetings in English. And the children of most politicians, including Lalu Prasad Yadav, tend to go to English medium schools. And they want their children to have access to English. So what I'm saying is that there is a rhetorical value to Indian languages. And within that, there's a special place for Hindi. But it has done a lot, Hindi itself has done a lot to, in a sense, pollute that space and to make it uninhabitable in many ways. This is a debate going on within the Hindi world as well, that the worst thing that has happened to Hindi has been these delusions of Rashtrabhasha. The national language delusions have harmed Hindi more than any other language. And it's not surprising at all that, as I'm sure you might be familiar with the census data, that Hindi speakers, people whose mother tongue is Hindi, are the least bilingual. So that I think all of these features point to what I'm essentially saying is that the rise of Hindi, the political rise of Hindi is largely a rhetorical rise. It does not mean the decline of English necessarily, even though the presence of English in the political sphere may change. It does not necessarily follow. But clearly, this is an area we need to watch because a lot is happening in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Satish. I suggest we take a few questions orally, like Shilja and Sayan raised their hands, and there are a lot of questions in the chat box, so then we can move to that
Yes,
as well.
I'm looking at the chat box.
Would you like me to go or Sayan to go, Jean Thomas, if you tell me?
Oh, as you wish, maybe you can start as you
Okay,
unmute
so
yourself.
thank you, Satish. That was absolutely brilliant, very thought-provoking. I'd like to add a dimension that I'm not an expert on, but I want to share in this growing feature. But the work we did on young workers in the IT sector, and I think we had a chance to discuss this about 5 years ago. But what was really interesting is the creation of spaces, and I think maybe we need to look within spaces to understand agency better. So I was talking to colleagues in linguistics out of my results, and they talk about the notion of code switching, how young people move from one language to another and emphasize certain features. And we saw this very clearly with people who are clearly learning English through BPOs, but there's a very powerful sense of their use of English, whether it's English, Tanglish, whatever. And we did research asking them which they would prefer to use, Tamil, English, or Tanglish, and they said English, because we can test it against what we're doing. So they're almost doing a kind of test process. And I'd like to know more and also to share more about these things. I think we are in a very rich area. And while the classificatory process of the censuses are exclusionary, these spaces are far more inclusionary. So I wanted to share that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shailaja. We'll talk more.
Sayan, would you like to add up to this question so that Satish can answer in a grouped manner?
Sure. So, I mean, thanks for that talk. It was really good. I have a question in which I have personal stakes too. So, I did my fieldwork in Delhi University studying student self-conception in English departments. And one of the things that I found is that, of course, in sort of interviews, a lot of these descriptions would come out in terms of how people experience English and the kind of exclusions they face. But one domain of exclusion was pedagogy, right? I mean, the classroom space. And I wonder, how are you thinking of, especially the question of agency vis-a-vis sort of, relationships set up in the classroom through which people have differential kind of claims on English, right? And related to that, a couple more things. So one I found is that part of the problem is, regarding how English is sort of thought of in terms of a normative academic literacy. And it seemed as if, to kind of transform English in terms of how people claim the language, there also has to be a kind of a transformation of how we think of, the literacy, the desirable sort of literacies one wants to achieve in the educational space. And also I wonder, what do you think of the paralinguistic aspects? Like when you do such a study or producing sort of, descriptions, how do you think of accounting for body language and tone? So how would one study that?
Most of what you're saying, I don't really have an answer for, and I'm as interested as you are in all of these things. The role of English as a kind of gatekeeper in higher education is a specific issue, and that really needs to be gone into. And I think this has to do with academic agency as a kind of, offshoot or a subset of agency in general. The problem that we have is that it's very rare, except perhaps in literary contexts, it's very rare for Indian languages to offer academic agency to students. And that is, I think, a real problem. So the language problem, the more cliched or the limited view of this, particularly the governmental view, is the translation-based view. So you throw money at the problem, and you set up this national translation mission and things like that, and you produce translations. But what you need to produce is academic agency via language. And to do that, mere translation will not do. And when translations are produced without agency, at worst, you produce unreadable translations. I can't tell you how many unreadable translations I've come across. Or you produce something that is usable, but inert, that has no life in it, and cannot inspire in the way that sort of writing by somebody inhabiting that language does. So this is, you're pointed to a major issue, and I think that's a very specific and special set of concerns, the language question in higher education, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, and we need to do more with it.
Right, so there are many questions from the chat box, so I would like to invite Karen first, and then Deepesh, and then Kirti, and then Ashoka, and then Aprajita, and then Shubi to in that order as possibly switch on their mic and ask their question directly to Satish.
Hi, Satish. And
hi, Karen. Yeah.
Hi, wonderful, thought-provoking talk. So, I mean, I was very interested in your journey with the idea of privilege, and also the way you tied it with caste and its, its own sort of journeys and sort of in India today. And I was wondering, because one has heard this whole, unlearn your privilege, that kind of slogan type of thing.
Yeah, check your privilege, as they say.
Yeah. So, but specifically unlearn, because when you present privilege in this, embedding of caste, then and in relationship to English as a sort of vehicle, can privilege be learned? That's my question. What do you?
Yes. That's really where I'm headed, or I'd like to end up there. I think in order to unlearn is an ambitious objective to have, I think, at the beginning, particularly for something like caste, which is so deeply embedded. And I expect, gender and race as well. So the necessary first step is to acknowledge and describe. And I think that's where we are at. Denial of caste essentially says that either it says that there are no differences, or it takes advantage of the narrower definition of privilege as unearned advantage by pointing to the hard work that has been put in by those who happen to be privileged. So we need to get around these things, and we need to, in order to get around them, privilege is not incompatible with hard work. Like the juxtaposition between the hard work and Harvard that's been going around. There's really no juxtaposition, really. I mean, you may need hard work to get into Harvard, etc. So my point really is that description is itself has liberatory potential and has to be the necessary first step. And we don't even have good description right now, because we don't recognize privilege even when we have been part of it in a very even when we have been intimate with it. In fact, especially when we have been intimate with it, and that's really that's the modest kind of first stage kind of thing that I'm interested in right now.
Thank you.
Deepesh, would you like, Deepesh and Kirti, would you like to? to ask your question.
Am I audible? My name is Deepesh.
Yes, I've seen your question. Do you have anything to add to that, or is that?
Yeah, just to add that, I mean, apart from what I've written in the question, the idea that, I mean, it's brilliant that you brought in caste and that kind of privilege into the question, which is, I think, central. But even more immediate in terms of the effect is the effect that English has on the tribal and minority languages. So in that's why I raised the question.
Yes, this is a question really that, I'm not really, I haven't thought enough about this, but I find myself unable to simply support or simply believe in preservationist sort of positions. There are some things that I feel will be lost, and in the process of whatever you want to call it, capitalism, development, or and so on. I'm more interested in questions of power, inequality, and privilege, and how these get reproduced within the ones that are salvageable or that for whatever reason get salvaged. So the question of the Ganesh Devi type of question of vanishing languages and so on, I haven't really thought about enough, and I don't feel that I have anything to say on that, beyond the fact that it seems to me that some things are inevitable, and the clock can't be turned back, and so on. Beyond that, I really don't have very much to say. What I'm really concerned about is vigorous living languages, which are also being bulldozed and which are in a sense being silenced or made culturally and conceptually emaciated, malnutrition. They are struck with because of the competition from surrounding languages. This is really the point that a friend of mine, Madhav Prasad, also makes, that and others have also made, that the situation in which we find ourselves in India with a colonial language and so on is actually fairly typical of the colonial situation. But we have been very, I'm not sure whether we are unique, but we have been definitely sort of ahead of the curve in the extent to which the presence of English has disabled Indian languages. That's definitely true. And this doesn't have to do with vanishing languages or languages that are direly threatened in the sense that you're talking about. This even has to do with flourishing languages that as languages are doing very well, and yet are not able to realize their full potential because they are in the shadow of English. So this is especially true in academics. What in the previous question we were talking about the role of English in the academy. So yes, you're pointing to an important question.
Thank you.
Right. I suggest we take several questions at the same time, so we can bundle them up.
Unless
right.
To ask in the.
Sure. So in particular, Ashoka Varden, who doesn't have a mic. So many, his question is the following. Many Indian languages are recognized and studied in their Brahmanized form or in the form used by the regional elites. What passes for you?
I can read that as well, Jantama. So don't bother reading them. I'm quickly going through them and seeing if we can club questions.
Sure. That sounds fair.
Yeah, Shailaja has already. Democratization of English. Yes. Linguistic justice. Okay. democratization of English is one major question, and regional creativities with English is another question, and elite forms. Okay, let's take these. Yes, elite forms are present in every language. Formalization of language immediately creates a hierarchy, with the norm language being privileged, particularly through the institutions of the state, notably schools and so on. This is an ongoing problem in every language. What I'm talking about is that English introduces a kind of meta element to this, since it applies. I mean, its corrosive effects apply to every language, every other language, no matter how dominant it is. So, in a sense, I'm talking about English in the context of dominance among the dominant. And still, this dominance is not unquestioned. It is not universal. It is qualified in many ways, notably in the political realm, in the market. It is qualified in the realm of the state. But despite being qualified, it remains a very active front. And that is what I think we should be paying attention to. So you're raising an important issue, and this is related to the fact that that no language is singular; it's always plural. It is in the nature of languages to be plural, and sources of difference. Colonies, regional creativities. Yes, a lot could be done. I think. See, I think what you're pointing to, this is about Parijita Sarkar's question. What is the creative dividend that English can provide to regional languages, to Indian languages, is, I think, the question you're asking. And this is a very fascinating question. Here, what distinguishes this question from the question I'm trying to deal with is that the site of concern is the regional language, is the Indian language. So you're concerned with Indian languages and what English can or cannot do for them or with them or to them in a sphere that is actually defined by the Indian language. That is one very important set of issues that you're raising. What I'm talking about is a different sphere, the sphere which English actually defines, and which the secular modern kind of context, globalized context, also contributes to or is also complicit with, where English is part of this all-encompassing context in a very overpowering sort of way. How do we handle English in such a context where we have differential access to different kinds of English? So this is in a sense a very complex mosaic of power relations that is being played out in this context. So what you're talking about is really important, but I'm interested in this other sphere. And then there was the question of democratization of English. A lot of this is an interesting question, and I think our attitudes towards this have changed a lot. I always remember, the famous India's best all-rounder ever, Kapil Dev Nikanj, used to appear for advertisements in the early days when he was young, for something called Rapidex English course, a kind of a primer to learn English. And initially, people like us, used to find that amusing or used to make fun of this. But I think in this particular respect, it's very interesting to see the changes that have happened. Two areas of massive success, wealth, fame, etc., are Bollywood movies and cricket. And it's very interesting to see the establishment of English in both these areas, even though it is not dominant. For example, I believe that even now scripts in Bollywood are written in Roman script, in English. And all the people working in the industry talk to each other in English. Not pure English, of course. There is a lot of mixture, but English remains the dominant language in this sphere. Whereas the success in this sphere is not, overtly dependent on English. Similarly, with cricket or a skill of that sort, I think this is related to class mobility. Once you cross a certain class threshold, English becomes essential. Some form of access to English becomes essential. And I think as more and more people have recognized this, the kind of amusement, the quality of the amusement at Kapil Dev doing these advertisements has changed drastically. I don't think we would talk in the same way today about this. So yes, in one sense, the democratization of English has been happening, but we have to look at what is the impact of this democratization. Is it in fact entrenching English even further, even as it democratizes access to English? What is it doing for agency is what we need to ask. But it's a very very dynamic, very changing area. Indianized English, yes, Indian English is now much more acceptable, but I think the criterion for me is still public announcements. I'm waiting for the day when announcements in English on, say, Delhi Metro or in airports will not be imitating a British or an American accent. It is possible to have an Indian accent. For example, the IT world recognizes an Indian accent today, and Indian English today. But our own state is still having difficulty with Indian English in this sense. So a lot can be done with Indianized English, I think, and I think a lot of creative stuff is possible here once we get over this knee-jerk, this unthinking response that only a certain kind of English is good enough. Right. Code switching and diglossia. Sorry, somebody was saying something.
Oh, no, please go ahead. I just want to mention that our Zoom session is limited, so we will be disconnected soon. So I invite those who want to ask a question to ask it now, because we have a few minutes left, and of course,
I will get
take
back
your
to
time.
Julian later.
Or you can address it in maybe concisely, and then I will take the last few questions.
Yes, I'm not quite. Yes, being multilingual is ordinary in India. Growing up with 4 languages is not at all surprising, and is almost the rule for most middle class people. The question is, what happens as a result of this, of these many languages? Because there being many does not take away from the inequality of languages. And we need to think about the specific kinds of inequality. This is a fascinating area that actually interests me. When I was growing up, my life was divided, very sharply divided into 3 linguistic zones. In one, I spoke with my classmates, which had to be Hindi. No English was allowed. One in my home, which was, we had a single home language, Kannada, a particular dialect of Kannada, not even standard Kannada. And then in the school, formal school, where it was only English. So this kind of linguistic apartheid is common to many people in India. I would really like to think more about this and invest terms like diglossia with local flavor. You know, with what does diglossia mean in a context like this? And what does code switching mean in a context like the Indian context? What does it achieve? What can it do for whom? Under what conditions? Questions like this really interest me. Okay.
Right. Those who have written their question but feel that it has not been addressed fully or not at all, this is your last chance. Could you please step in and ask your question so that we conclude the session.
Hi, Jean-Thomas. This is Divya here. In case no one else is stepping in, maybe I could post my question.
Sure, sure. Go ahead.
Hi, Satish. So basically, I was just to respond to the last point you mentioned. I was thinking of the works of people like Bernard Bate, who takes up this. I mean, who sort of moves away from the diglossic register into taking heteroglossia more seriously, and he does this in his history of Dravidian movement and political movements and the construction of this proper Tamil, Sen Tamil, and it's that. So that kind of. So I thought that that literature would be useful, especially if you're looking at whether there are similarities between the modalities of constructing proper languages across languages, not just English, but also the very many others that we speak in India. And the second point I thought was maybe it would be useful to think of both privilege and agency vis-a-vis by introducing the third element, which often people don't concentrate on, which is the question of pleasure and aesthetics. I don't mean this primarily in the Bourdieusian sense, but instead in the sense of looking at how we learn to derive pleasure. I mean, this is in response to the particular illustration you provided, which is when do we have this visceral pleasure when we realize that competence in English gains us things that we might otherwise not have been able to hold or gain. Yeah. So the question, so if once we introduce the element of aesthetization and its connection to, well, I was thinking power, but you're more interested in privilege and so on, then we could also link pleasure, the production of pleasure, as something that is not just, not as something that is purely individual or related to the self, but also is something that emerges from within a community of practitioners, so that our pleasure in writing something in English or any other language actually derives from the feedback that we get from educators, which we might have got when we were at school, but we continue to get that from our peers and senior others in the same community of practitioners in the academians. That's it.
Yeah. Thank you, Divya. That was really, really. In fact, I've been thinking of Bani a lot because it's talking to him. Many of these ideas first started talking to him many years ago. That's many years ago. What Bani's work does is really talk about the kind of agency that a certain kind of Tamil is able to produce at a certain moment in history, right? The Dravidian movement, and so on. That is exactly the kind of thing we need to talk about. What kinds of agency can be produced by what kinds of languages? And within that larger sphere, there is this huge conundrum of English. The question of pleasure you raised, I think what is distinctive about English is not this pleasure. This pleasure can be experienced with any language, and we have very vigorous literary traditions in all our major languages. So the question of the pleasure of language is indeed, I think, quite democratized, and there are people who can talk eloquently about this in many languages. What I'm talking about is that it so happens that if your particular pleasure, the pleasure of language, is English related, many other things are available to you that are not available to somebody who encounters this pleasure through Hindi, say, or through Telugu or Tamil or whatever other language. There are many other things that are not available to that person. Through the serendipity, well, not entirely serendipity, really, through the fact that this thing called English is connected to so many other things that are enmeshed with power and privilege and mobility and all kinds of things. But you're right that this is really a critical area, and the kind of exercise that went on with Tamil is particularly instructive, and I think similar kinds of work need to be done with so many other of our languages, which have their own very special histories.
Thank
Can
you
I
so
ask?
much. Sure, Nandan.
Okay. Yes, just a second. Because basically, I was interested to ask Professor Deshpande, because he was saying about the school is the most interesting side. Incidentally, I teach in a school which offers international curriculum, and language is very important over there. While they actually have a interesting thing is in the sense that we offer IB, and they tend to promote local or regional languages as a second language. But incidentally, what we find here that we offer Japanese, Mandarin, Korean, Spanish, French, everything other than English, but we don't promote Bengali as a regional language. Just simply because, that what I felt that basically, as you're talking about the agency and the enabling or privilege factor, this is actually operating as a ideological constraint as well, which means that speaking good English, accented English, or English, other languages which are very elementary level, have initio. It's basically not even the certificate level, but still they are opting for that, not the standard Bengali languages or the Hindi as such. So basically, what I mean to say that this ideological constraint of being an international platform, a member of a platform, is basically leading them not to look at that, even the IB pronounced policies, and they tend to ignore these local languages, and this is actually going against the provisions of democratizations. It's basically marginalizing the languages where it is actually being sending up. How do you look at that? These ideological factors, which is playing as a constraint.
Yes, but to my mind, there would be functional or instrumental aspects associated with language. But what makes language interesting is that it is not limited to those aspects. So I'm interested really in the interface between the instrumental or functional aspects of language and its constitutive, socially constitutive aspects. Language does a lot more than lead to jobs or provide incomes and so on. It also can do that. And it is not surprising that people want to learn Japanese rather than Bengali, because there are more jobs to be had with but if you learn Japanese. But that kind of learning Japanese is not necessarily, for most people, it is not necessarily something very deep. just like you would learn, Python or C++ as a language because it gets you jobs, you would learn Japanese. And I don't see at that level. I don't see that as an interesting, intellectual question. Whereas when we look at language somewhat more broadly as constitutive as well, we come up with a whole lot of things, and it is the sort of inseparability of these two with English in India that makes it, for me, a fascinating subject. Both things are true. English is learned exactly like a programming language or some other skill that can get a job, but it is also capable of a lot more. And I would recommend. I meant to talk about it, but forgot this very interesting book by Snigdha Poonam called Dreamers. There's a section there about it's about these people who take English courses and also teach these English courses, learning English, and she talks precisely about a sense of agency that these people experience. People who have had no exposure to English whatsoever and are learning it entirely functionally, entirely instrumentally, as a source of mobility, and yet they experience this sense of agency, which I thought was really illuminating and needs to be thought about and used in our work.
Right. I suggest we bring it to a close. This has been a really fascinating discussion. In fact, really, really richly textured interaction. I would really like to reiterate CSH thanks to you, Satish, and to the audience also for being so willingful to interact and to ask questions. So I would cordially invite all of you to reconvey in 15 days as we will have a mathematician Mathieu Faure who will be speaking on inequality for our next seminar, and then yes, so we will end the Zoom now, and thank you again, and hopefully see you in 15 days for
Thank you.
Thank you, Satish, again.
I saw so many friends there. I'm sorry I couldn't speak to all. Thank you all for coming, and the struggle will continue.
Sure. You're welcome, Satish.
Thank you.
Thank you.